Hello, and welcome to today's ICMA webinar titled Building and Maintaining Your Best Board. I'd like to introduce your speaker for today, Dottie Schindlinger. Dottie Schindlinger is the Vice President in Marketing and Governance Technology Evangelist for the Diligent Corporation, the parent company of Board Effect. In her role, Dottie promotes the intersection of board governance and technology as a recognized expert in the field. She provides thought leadership through a variety of digital and print publications, webinars, conferences, and in-boardroom presentations to directors and executives globally. Dottie, when you're ready, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Allison, and good afternoon, everybody. Just to clarify, it's Board Docs, not Board Effect, but that's okay. So it's my good pleasure to be here with you this afternoon, and I'm looking forward to speaking with all of you about building and maintaining your best board, which of course is a bit of an interesting and unique challenge when you work in a public institution, where you obviously go through election cycles and potentially have appointees, and so the level of control that you have over who gets, becomes a member of the board is sometimes pretty negligible. And so we're going to talk about the interesting challenges that come into really helping to encourage the candidates that you hope will run for election, and then once you have all the new members in place, how do you bring that group up to speed in terms of how to be a good team, how to function well in their role as directors, and really how to provide the best performance and the best outcomes for your city, municipality, county, or other governing body. So that's what we're going to cover today. And as I wanted to mention just really briefly, we will be having a presence at the ICMA conference, which is coming up here in just a few weeks. And so we will be doing a session there as well, which I think is going to be really interesting on the topic of shared governance. So we hope that if this topic is of interest to you, if these concepts are of interest to you, that you'll come and find us and hopefully come attend that session, which I think is going to be really interesting and a really good session. So just to kind of get started here, I want to just share with you what we have planned. The first thing we're going to do is talk about board development as a cycle. It's helpful to think about board development as a cycle because basically right when you get to the end and are thinking about evaluating the board performance, you really are rolling right back into the beginning of the next cycle in terms of helping new members come on board and orient them and get them ready for their roles. So it's helpful to think about this as kind of a never-ending cycle of activity, one activity flowing neatly into the next. So we'll talk about what that four-part cycle looks like and what it includes. I'll try to provide some specific, actionable, and tactical tips and tools that you can use to enhance the board development process. And then finally, hopefully give you some strategies that you can go back and share with your own board, maybe have a discussion about some of the issues and see if you can implement some of the information that we're sharing. So first of all, I always like to provide a little bit of context for the topic. And when you think about board development, in some cases you might be thinking, well, why does this matter? Why should we care about how well developed our board is? They come in, they do their fiduciary role, they make decisions about the budget, they deal with the issues. Why does it matter whether or not they're a good team or whether or not they are performing well? Well, there's a couple of things that I think lend some credence to the idea that focusing time and energy on developing the board is time well spent. First of all, the landscape itself is changing. And while that obviously differs by municipality and by region, there is just no question whatsoever that we are living in an era that economists would call VUCA. So that's V-U-C-A, and that stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And that concept, I think, is a nice way to encapsulate what we've been experiencing over these last 10 years or so since the economic crash, in terms of the political landscape, in terms of the mood of the country, in terms of the cohesion or divisiveness of our communities, in terms of major economic forces. Things are absolutely volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And so what that means is that board members' jobs are getting harder. They're not getting easier. And when I think about, I first got into governance work about 20 years ago, we would spend time on talking about things like how do we help the board perform better and how do we find the right candidates. But there was always sort of an assumption that candidates were kind of grown out in the field somewhere, and then we just found the right ones and brought them on the board and magic happened. And I think those days are kind of gone. Now, no matter who joins your board, no matter whether they come in the door with all the skills they need or not, you actually have to do a good amount of work to make sure that they can come up to speed on the context, the specific realities on the ground, and then you have to try to understand what skill sets they bring to the table, what perspectives they bring to the table that can be leveraged to really have the best outcomes. So it's become just a much harder job being a really good board member. And of course, when we think about who we would love to serve on our boards, if we think about the people in our communities that we think, oh boy, it'd be great if that person ran for office, if we could encourage them to do this, they're always the people that have the least amount of time. So the most desirable candidates are always the ones that are overtaxed because they're awesome. So everyone asks them to do everything. But in the meantime, our communities have a much higher level of expectation for what we're going to be able to accomplish. And that's becoming exceedingly more true, especially as social media becomes the norm. People are now reviewing and rating everything from where they ate dinner to how good was the service at the local gas station to whether or not the city council is doing its job. And so we have this different level of scrutiny coming directly from our community members than maybe we ever have before. And so I love this quote from Gary Hamel. If you've never read any of his work, most of his books sort of read like a collection of headlines, but this one I think is particularly apt to what we're talking about. The world is becoming more turbulent, faster than most organizations are becoming more resilient. And that word resiliency, I think, is really key. When we think about this kind of climate that we're in, resiliency is the thing that matters, probably more than anything else. If we're able to weather the storm, and sometimes that's a literal storm, as is happening, of course, right now in the southern part of the U.S., but if we can find a way through the chaos and come out the other side, we're going to be the winners. And that's really true. The organizations that win in this kind of an environment of uncertainty are those that can be resilient and can pivot on a dime. Well, so if that's the case, that probably means that we need to think a little bit about how we're preparing our board members to be successful in that kind of climate. And again, the old playbook just might not be sufficient anymore. It might have been amazing for the last 30 or 40 years, but we're in a different time now. Things have changed. We might have to step up our game or just change our game and do things a little bit differently. So just to talk a little bit about this cycle, I like to think of dividing the development process into 4 parts. The first is what I call planning and recruitment. Of course, in public entities, recruitment is a little bit of a different process than in private entities where, people that join the board are often elected by the sitting board members, and clearly that's not usually the case in a public institution. But there is a good deal of planning that should go into every board cycle, including prior to elections, having a good understanding of the strengths and opportunities and networks of the people that are going to be continuing on in their term, so that when the new candidates come in, we can start to sort of understand the map of what we actually have around the table. So we'll talk about that planning process a little bit. Then we'll talk about, once we have the new members in place, how do we actually orient and onboard them to position them for success? So that's where things really can kind of pick up some steam, and you can really think clearly about how do we bring them on in such a way that they're going to be able to add material value quickly and have a very good experience on the board. And then the next part of the cycle is really ongoing. It's thinking about engagement. How do we continually engage the board members and do that in a way that's appropriate, both in terms of open meeting law, but also just in terms of keeping them sort of keeping the board at forefront of their minds. I mean, they often have other things in their lives that they've got to do. So how do we help make sure that their board service takes some priority in their thought process on a daily basis? And then finally, if we've done a really good job front-loading the process in terms of planning and everything else, how do we then finally evaluate how well the board did and maybe use that evaluation to inform how we ensure retention of the members that are doing exceptionally well, or encourage changes if change is required. So that's really the 4-step cycle. And what we're going to do is kind of go through each step, and we'll do this sort of briefly. I'm noticing some questions coming in, which is great. And so I'm going to, take questions kind of throughout the presentation, but I'd like to get through a little bit about recruitment first as I'm looking at this particular question, because I have a feeling that some of the answers are going to be embedded in what I'm about to present. So I'm going to table that question for just a moment. Thanks for asking it, and we'll come back to that in just a moment. So let's start with just planning for recruitment. And of course, city managers, county managers, play a very active role in helping to encourage members of their community to think about running for office. And so I always think the first thing to do that is the most important in terms of how you plan for that process is to start with, well, who do we currently have around the table and that are going to be continuing on in their term? And what skill sets and aptitudes and perspectives do they lend to our conversations? So it's always useful to start with, what do we already have? And then as we do that exercise, we can then maybe begin to identify some gaps, places where we'd really like to have additional perspectives, or maybe diversity in terms of demographics, or maybe diversity in terms of representation within the community. So I like to always suggest to organizations that I've worked with on this approach to create something called a board profile matrix. Now, there's a number of these that you can find for free online. If you just do a search for board profile matrix, you'll find a bunch of them out there. I always think that the most helpful ones are those that take into account a few different ways of thinking about your board. So not just demographics. A lot of board profile matrices just focus on that person's age range, their gender, their race, ethnicity, maybe their geographic location, maybe their degree that they received from college or from grad school or certifications. But it doesn't often take into account some of the things that, quite frankly, might matter more in terms of how the board actually gels. Some things like, what kinds of perspectives does this person bring to the table? What's their approach to decision making? Are they someone that likes to have all the data and all the facts and weigh out lots of scenarios before a decision is made? Or are they someone who likes to just plow ahead, get the decision going, and then inspect and adapt as they move forward? You kind of need a mixture. You know, if you have a group of people that they never like to make a decision until all the facts are known, it's going to be a very slow-moving process. Versus if you have people that all like to just jump to decisions, they might not always make the best ones. So having a mixture kind of helps to balance that out. You've got people pushing the group to go faster, and you've got people in the group that are sort of saying, wait, slow down a little bit. We need a bit more information before we can make a call on something. So I always like to have the matrix kind of divided between perspectives, expertise, and competency areas. And the competency areas might be something that you actually want to put together specifically for your municipality or city or county. For example, depending on your unique circumstances, it might be really useful to have someone serving on your board who's got expertise in land use and land planning, or maybe someone who's got expertise in, floodplain and flood insurance, or maybe someone who's got legal expertise, or a CPA, or someone who's got connections in the business community and maybe is a successful entrepreneur. Those lists of important competencies are going to totally be different from place to place. So you don't want to look for a generic list. You really want to think about, well, what's really going to make the most difference for our institution, for our organization, and come up with that list. So once you do that, you can then sort of just across the top, down the left-hand side of let's call it an Excel sheet, for example, you put all the different competencies and things that you're looking for. And then along the top in the columns, you can just list the names of the people that currently serve on the board and just basically check the boxes, who's got what. And if you need help with that exercise, get the board members to help you. Have them fill in what they believe is true for them. And that way, you've got a kind of a clearer picture of where the gaps might be. If you see rows where there's absolutely nothing checked, then you can have a conversation at the board table about, well, how do we feel about maybe, encouraging some candidates that bring these things to the table to run for office? And that's a really useful exercise. The second part of planning then, once you kind of identify the needs, is to get real clarity about the role and process of, how you're going to go about the recruitment process. So the first thing I think that it's important to do is to have the board have a conversation around what is the board's purpose and what are the priorities for the upcoming year, for the upcoming cycle. This is interesting, right? Because you might think, well, the board's purpose is obvious. We all know what the board does. But I bet you'd be surprised if you actually bring that up in conversation at the board table, how many different obvious answers there are to that question. Every time I've asked this question in any boardroom, and I've been a few hundred, I get a few thousand responses. So people might not have a lot of consensus about what the purpose is of the board. Some might think, well, really, we're just here to, focus on the budget. And some might say, well, no, we're really here to represent the interests of the community. And someone might say, no, we're really here to make sure that we think long range about the planning of this community and do it really well. I bet you will find a diversity of opinions. And so it's very good to have that conversation before you go through the recruitment process so that you can start to try to get some clarity around what does the board think of as its role. And then once you get some level of consensus there, you can get the board to get maybe more consensus about what is the board's set of priorities for the next year or for the next cycle. And when I say the board set of priorities, what I mean are, what are the specific policy areas, what are the specific focus areas for conversation that the board has identified are important for it to cover in that next year or cycle, not things that they're going to ask the manager to go and do, and not things that the board has no control over. I'm talking about things that the board actually does that can be measured, that they can hold themselves accountable to. And the reason this is so important is that when you get to the end of the cycle and you need to do a board evaluation, you got to know what you're evaluating. You got to know what were the standards and the criteria that the board was holding itself to, so that at the end of the game, you can actually measure how well they did. So those are a couple of things. And then finally, I know a lot of different municipalities and cities and counties that do a kind of a public call for nominations, which I think is really cool. But the bottom line is just have a really clear and simple process that gets articulated out as broadly as possible how someone can either nominate themselves or stand for election or get involved in the process. And the reason I say do that as broadly as possible is that, look, there really kind of are no bad answers here, right? If someone is really, passionate about doing this and they want to do this, it's going to play out however it's going to play out. I don't think that obscuring the process is actually any approach to changing that outcome. I think much better would be to try to engage with people who seem passionate about doing this to make sure that they fully comprehend, you know what, we're delighted that you're passionate about doing this. That's really cool that you're going to run for office. We wish more people would be more engaged. And before you do this, we thought it'd be helpful for you to kind of understand, here's what that job description is. Here's the priorities that we have for the next cycle. Here's what the board really envisions as its purpose. I think being more transparent in this case actually ends up having a better outcome because, again, you're not going to necessarily have control over who's going to run and who's going to do this, but you can potentially help inform the process on their side and make sure that they understand, we're enthusiastic when people want to do this. We want them to be realistic about what it's going to mean. It may not mean everything they think it's going to mean. And so we just want to be really clear about what that's going to look like for you. So that can be really helpful as well. And then in terms of some recruitment tactics, some of these I think are a bit more aligned with when you're a private institution, but I'll run down how you might adapt them in the case of, encouraging people to run for election or encouraging people to throw their hat in the ring for an appointment. So a couple things. There are a number of really good external and online resources to just kind of get the word out there. One that I'm a big fan of is actually through LinkedIn. They have a new site or a new service called LinkedIn for Nonprofits, where if you're a nonprofit or a public entity, for I think it's either free or extremely low cost, you can post advertisements for volunteer roles or for open board seats and kind of put into that information a short job description and a short description of the board and of the community or of the organization. And I'm a huge fan of that because LinkedIn is becoming such a giant network of people that are looking for opportunities and, maybe haven't even ever thought about getting involved, in their local communities in this way, who might bring a lot to the table that you really need. So just kind of getting the word out there is always a good idea. And then, of course, you can also, from the other side of the table, search the database to find people that are from your community that you think, wow, that person would be amazing. Look at all these things that they do. Look at all these ways they're connected. We didn't even know they existed. And maybe we can encourage them. And once you find them on LinkedIn through the nonprofit side of the table, you can just send them a link to your open board seat and encourage them to think about, running or throwing their hat in the ring. So that's something that you can do. If you do receive appointments on your board, something else you can do is provide this board profile matrix and the board's priorities and the clarity of the board's purpose to appointers. And you can say, look, here are some names we'd like you to think about, but as we give you these names, let us tell you why we thought these would be good names. Here are the things that we're looking for. Here are the things we're missing. Here's the things we already have. Here's where we're hoping to go in the next cycle, and this is what the board has articulated as its overall set of priorities and its purpose. And most appointers, look, they'll make decisions the way that they're going to make, obviously, but they often really appreciate that kind of guidance, because even if they don't exactly pick the people you suggest, giving them that kind of guidance around what it is that you actually need can help them think about names that would be a better fit than maybe the ones they had originally thought of. So when they get that kind of guidance, they tend to use it. They may not use it exactly the way you expect, but they tend to use it. It's very helpful to them and gives them some clarity. I also think that if you have committees that involve non-board members, if that's ever a situation where you've got, task forces or other groups that just, combine people that are either elected as well as maybe those that just sort of join on a volunteer basis, they can serve as great pipelines of talent for future elections. And I'm sure many of you are doing this, but whenever you have something that doesn't require an elected seat, it's just a group of volunteers that get together and take action, it's often like the farm league, the farm school that kind of sends the stars up to the next level. That can really work that same way for your board, and you might really find some interesting talent in that way. And then there's an idea that came out of California, actually, from a group called Compass Point, called the Blue Ribbon Nominating Committee. The idea is that you pull together a group of luminaries in your community that wow, they would be the most amazing board members for us, but I know not a one of them will ever run for election. They're way too busy. They're way too overextended. But they might be willing to come have breakfast with you. And that's what the Blue Ribbon Nominating Committee is all about. You offer, have a breakfast, and it's just a community breakfast, and what you want to do is talk with them about, here's what we have, here's what we're looking for, this is our set of priorities. Could you help suggest some names of people we should call and maybe encourage to think about running for service? That can be a very powerful strategy, and you can open it up to anyone who wants to come. The idea would be you also want to specifically target and invite the people who you most want to hear from, because they will have a different network than the existing board and a different network than your municipality, so they will be able to help kind of feed in to that pipeline some potential new folks. So there's a couple different things. And then just lastly, I always think that it's a great idea to have recruitment updates at every board meeting, so the board members are kind of holding themselves accountable to thinking about their own succession. Look, I think everybody wants to believe that they'll get reelected all the time, or some of them may actually not want that. Many of them might say, you know what, one term or 2 terms is enough. I'm done. I've done my time. I want to do something else now. And that's fine. The idea would be, look, it's never going to be a static body, the board. It's going to change a little bit every year or every couple of years. So it's worthwhile to just always have a recruitment mindset and be thinking about ways to encourage people to do this. And last but not least, all of our meetings have this open requirement. We have public participation, community participation in our meetings. I don't think it's a terrible idea to suggest to those that come that they think of themselves as sort of observers of what the board process looks like, so that they can kind of roll around in their minds whether or not this might be something they would be interested in down the road, and maybe even become sort of a little bit of ambassadors for what it means to serve in the public. Maybe talk to others about why they think it's important, why did they go to those meetings, and so on. So anyway, so that's a little bit around board recruitment, and I noticed we had a couple questions here. And so I'm going to address a couple of these questions. So one question was about, as a manager, how active should you become in encouraging people to run for the board? And when does this border on too involved in the politics? Such a good question. Again, I think if you're going through a rigorous process, the way that I've described, where you're really trying to uncover what are your needs, what are your focus areas, what are the things that you need to be thinking about, then it's very helpful to kind of encourage broadly. Again, you're not going to have a lot of control in the outcome, but you can have a bit of control in helping to shape the way people think about the election process in terms of what the needs are for the board. So I think really communicating that more, not less, and doing it as broadly as possible, so that you're not, you're really not taking a political stance. You're not saying we want people with these specific political leanings, and that's certainly not what you're interested in. I think more so you're like, look, we have a group that is diverse and represents the community in these ways, but we know that we have gaps, and here are some of the things that we think are gaps. We'd love your help in finding people that you think would be great on the board that would bring these perspectives that we really feel we need. We'd also love to hear from you what other perspectives you think that we're missing. So I think engaging with the public in that way is healthy and not necessarily going to be leaning in one direction or the other politically. Okay, there's a long sort of question here, so I'm gonna kind of take some time to review that one and maybe ask Allison to summarize that one for me a little bit later on. But I want to keep rolling since we time is of the essence here, and I'll make sure to get through these points. So kind of moving off of the recruitment end of things, I want to talk a little bit about, so now you have new board members. How do you orient and onboard them in a way that is going to bring them up to speed quickly? And these two little photos here kind of, for me, represent most of the orientation and onboarding processes that I've ever been a part of. They either tend to look a little bit like a dog and pony show, or they tend to be this ramp up to nowhere, meaning you get people really excited about their service, you tell them all these cool things that are going to happen, and then when the service actually happens, it looks nothing like what they were sort of told to expect. It's completely different from what they were told to expect. And so a couple of things that I would suggest as maybe some strategies to make this a little bit better is, first of all, I think a lot of us think of orientation as an episode. We think of it as a single meeting where we gather people together and we tell them their jobs, and then we just expect them to perform those jobs. And frankly, I think that's probably a little unrealistic. I don't know about you, but every new job I've ever taken, it has taken me months to get to the place where I'm really comfortable in that role and understand what I'm doing. In fact, I'm in a little bit of a new position now because Diligent has become the parent company of Board Docs and of Board Effect. And, so now I've been here with Diligent for going on about 8-9 months, and I still don't always know the names of the conference rooms. I still am not entirely sure who all my coworkers are, what they do. So, it can really take time. And so I think it's much more important to think of orientation as a process. Think of orientation as something that certainly kicks off with an initial meeting, but should really include some self-study on the part of the board members. It should also include some opportunity for the board members to really get to understand the context within which they're going to be doing those jobs and the kinds of issues that are likely to come to the table. And to really, get to understand the city or county manager a bit better and understand, what are some of the things that are on that person's mind? What are some of the pressures that that person is under? The more that they can know about the situation and how they fit into the picture, the better they're going to be able to perform their role. I certainly think that it's important to have kind of a board member 101. If you have any kind of a board website or any kind of an electronic tool that you use to communicate with your board, that's an awesome place to put this stuff because, quite frankly, I can say this as a current board member, I am always going back to the bylaws. I'm always going back to our policies. I'm always going back and rooting through the minutes to see things because I'm very much a contextual thinker. I like to know, okay, when we talked about this last time, I know we arrived at this decision, but I want to remind myself how we arrived there. And that kind of context and history and understanding is super important to me to be able to do a really good job in the moment. I don't want to be the one board member that slows down the proceedings of the meeting because I just need to know how did we decide this last time, and now we end up talking all about the last meeting, and we're not actually pushing the business forward. So having that capability to continually orient myself and make myself smarter, I find that really powerful, and I find that it makes me better in the moment. I think giving that same capability to your board members can be really important. So just think about putting that 101 stuff together, but making it in a place where they can kind of search it, mine it, go back to it, reflect on it, and so on. And then I know this one is maybe a little bit difficult with open meeting laws, but it is important to have some kind of social component at meetings. And you can certainly do this, with the public participation. But here's the thing. What we need our boards to be when they're in the moment at the board table, we need them to be a team. And there's really no way that they're ever going to form a team if they don't know each other. I mean, think about it, right? We trust people we know. We feel more comfortable talking about hard issues with people that we know. And it's really difficult, right? We get new people that come on each year and they don't know anybody yet. And they're feeling probably a little bit uncomfortable. And they probably also feel like they've got to come in and make their mark. And so those are pressures that we can hopefully try to alleviate a little bit by just providing opportunities for people to get to know one another. And so, it's not a terrible idea, at least at the first couple of board meetings where there's some new board members, to just have everybody kind of go around the table and share something about themselves that would help others get to know them. Something about their history, where they went to school, or what kind of a place did they grow up, or what were some of the things they used to love to do when they were kids, or just anything kind of personal. It doesn't have to be embarrassing and it doesn't have to be weird, but just allowing people to get to know each other. And again, that doesn't require a closed session. It's just really a way to get the group more comfortable. If possible, it's helpful to have a board buddy. Now, I'm really a huge favor of using former board members for this role. Because when people rotate off the board, whether they were rock stars or just kind of mediocre, they certainly know a lot about the way the board works. And so if they're willing to remain involved in a volunteer capacity, they make excellent mentors. Just someone that board member can comfortably call and just say, hey, you know what, I just have a question about, how this normally happens. That we're going to be going into some interesting conversations. They don't even have to give any detail, but they can just say, I just have a question about if I have something I want to raise, what's the right way to do that? Or, if I want to reach out to another board member, I know that I really can't do that without the meeting. So how do I get questions answered? Where do I go? Do I go to the manager? So sometimes having just that sounding board can be super helpful, and make sure that it's someone that it's totally cool for them to call, doesn't have to be a current board member, and obviously, not sharing confidences, but giving them a place where they can ask questions that they might not want to ask in the middle of the board meeting where they might make them feel stupid. That's extremely helpful. And then finally, something called annual board commitments. This does not have to be a super formal process. But basically, if you're a board member, one of the things that you're often thinking about is, how do I know at the end of the year whether I've done a good job? And so having just a list of things that you hope you will accomplish as a board member, or what the board will accomplish, can be really useful, because then at evaluation time, you can use that as a tool to determine whether or not you have been successful. Let me pause there for just a moment. Allison, I noticed that we have a long question here. I'm wondering if you've had a chance to kind of read that through, and what's the gist of that question? I'd be happy to answer it. I want to make sure to address it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's similar to maybe the other question, but talking about ethical concerns as well, and it ends with the question, what advice do you offer about walking the line between ICMA ethical obligations and the tasks you've touched on in the presentation? Professional managers are not in the business of nominating candidates, developing slates, et cetera. Yep.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for reading that through. I was trying to read and present at the same time, and that's always dangerous. So I apologize if I'm going to miss some of the nuance of your question. It looks like it was a beautifully crafted question, so I'm going to try my best, but feel free to keep me honest if I don't answer your question. But I think I understand the gist, which is you're 100% right. I mean, city managers and county managers, you can't create a slate of candidates, of course not. But what you can do is you can kind of create the dream profiles of board members that you're seeking, knowing that you're probably seeking more than one, and then put that out into the community as broadly as possible. So you're not handpicking anyone, but what you are trying to do is reach the ears and eyes of someone who maybe really would be perfect for your board, that hasn't considered running but has the bandwidth to do so and would be interested to do so. You're just trying to align the stuff you need with the people who are appropriate and available. And so, I think what you do is you really focus on the kind of the profile of a magical candidate, or several magical candidates if they exist, and then you're trying to get that out into the ether as broadly as possible so that it hopefully connects with that individual. And if you do know of individuals that would be great, maybe just making sure that they get a copy of that along with everyone else in the world. So not trying to game the system, not trying to do anything unethical at all. You're going to have to leave it up to the universe what happens from there. But what you can do on the front end is provide a very clear picture of the kinds of expertise and perspectives and background and skill sets and demographics that you really, really, really hope to find. And I would certainly make that something that is discussed at one of the public meetings before the nomination cycle, so that people who come to the meetings can hear it too, and hopefully help to spread the word. So I hope that helps to answer the question. But again, I'll be happy to share my contact information after this. If people want to ask other questions, I'd be happy to speak with them. Allison, thank you for that. So just kind of moving towards, thank you. So moving towards a little bit of the second half of this, or actually sort of the third half of this, if you will, to use the old car talk reference. It's helpful to think about what the profile of the board is. As you're thinking about things like the board's purpose and how can we really position them for success, This is a model that comes out of some work from Harvard. It's now just about 10 years old, but there was a gentleman by the name of Richard Chait and his two co-authors, William Ryan and Barbara Taylor, put together this book called Governance as Leadership, reframing the work of the nonprofit board. And while they were focused in nonprofits, they certainly looked at a broad array of different kinds of institutions. And what they were looking for were what are the things that kind of set apart the winners, those that just seem to outperform everyone else in every way. And one of the things they identified seemed to kind of set them apart was that their boards operate in a different fashion. They engage in more generative style governance, which is a whole other topic for another webinar. And really what that looks like in many respects is kind of a shared governance approach. And I thought this model was interesting to share in this audience, because shared governance, I think, really describes what you do, right? All of your board meetings have public participation, except for closed session. The public is involved, and they're having commentary, and they're giving you their feedback, they're giving you their input. But when all of that is working the way that it's supposed to, basically, I think the way that it's really supposed to work is that the public is to come to the board with things that are on their mind, with things that they think are important in the community, and the board is then to take that under consideration. Excuse me. And again, if that's working right, the community is bringing to the board things that really matter and things that should be thought about. Now, we know that that's not always the reality, because been to many city council meetings where people have a platform and they just kind of get up and say whatever's on their mind that has nothing to do with anything that we could actually affect change on, or would affect anyone else anywhere. We know that. But that said, that idea of shared governance where the board is kind of laying out, look, here are the things that we have identified as priorities. Here's how we see ourselves operating to get to those priorities. And here are the things that we really want to know from the community. And let's work together to kind of push this forward and make sure the community is healthy and well. What's interesting about this idea is when there are really tough things that the board has to deal with, which frankly happens in every municipality, city, county, always there's going to be something that will happen in just about every board cycle that is going to be a tough choice, a tough decision. The organizations that do more of this shared governance approach, where they're really helping the community to see its role in informing the board and providing fodder for board conversation, they tend to have less pushback when they have to make really hard choices, meaning the community understands here were all the things that the board was thinking about. Here were all the pressures that they were under. Here were the constraints on how they could make the decision. Here's what the possible set of outcomes might have been, and they made this choice. Even if I kind of hate the choice they made, I sort of get it, and I maybe am not as pissed. Maybe I'm not as angry. And that has been kind of shown to be the case. The more that the people feel like they've been involved in some way, they've had their say, they've had their voices heard, and then the board makes a decision and is able to articulate all the things that were at pressure, they definitely seem to have a better outcome. So with that in mind, having engagement strategies for the board is really a very good strategy to make the board meetings themselves run better. So for example, one thing that you can do, and I don't know happens quite all that often at council meetings, at least not those that I've attended, it's always helpful to kind of go back and reconnect the board members to the meaning of why they are there. And I don't mean because they won an election. I mean, look, they were passionate about something. There was something that drove them to want to do this. There was a reason that they decided to do this. And I'm certain it was some reason because they were very passionate about it. They had something that they wanted to do to change. And so having an opportunity to allow the board members to kind of reconnect with that and giving them more opportunities to do collaboration in the boardroom as is appropriate and to do more generative thinking, meaning we stop and we ask questions that start with the words what if or why, or how does this connect to the overall success and health of the community? Or to what extent would this negatively impact our stakeholders? If they have more of those kinds of conversations, you're going to get a much deeper and more meaningful and more objectively measurably positive level of engagement from the board. And it also helps to engage the community. Something that's really interesting, I've had a number of conversations recently with city managers and with city council members about this idea of engagement and sort of having those deep generative conversations in the boardroom. And what I've been hearing back from a lot of people is that often they will have those kinds of conversations, but sort of in a workshop format and behind closed doors. And I have to say, I get that pressure. I get that feeling of we should have this conversation out of the limelight until we have something that's more than half-baked, and then we'll come to the community and make it public. But I often think that maybe that's actually the reverse of what should happen, because quite frankly, if the community is engaged in seeing how the board is arriving at a decision, they're going to be much more invested in the final outcome. And they're going to probably have a much more positive reaction to whatever the outcome is, even if it wasn't the outcome they thought they wanted in the beginning. It's one of those things to say, like, if you kind of sit and watch how the sausage is made, it might not fully diminish how enjoyable the sausage is at the end, but you definitely have a much greater understanding of what went into that process, and it makes you see it differently forever. So it's just something to think about. Again, I'm sure that this is a suggestion that a lot of you will be like, bah humbug, we'll never do that, and that's fine. But I just want to put it out there that usually people feel much more positively and much more involved in decisions that they've seen come to fruition rather than decisions that are simply announced without ever seeing what went into that decision. And since we have such hard jobs to do, it's helpful to give that kind of insight for your board members. Really briefly, I want to share with you, this is kind of an interesting summary of what a great board meeting agenda might look like. This comes from a consultant based out on the West Coast named Susan Howlett. And again, she was speaking more about the nonprofit board, but I think there's some merit here for the public entity. First of all, you know, her goal here is to try to keep the meetings pretty brief. Now, I know that in terms of public meetings, they can extend for hours and hours and hours and hours because of all the public participation component of it. And so, of course, you're not going to have a ton of control over that. But you do have control over the part that is you know, just the standard proceedings of the board meeting. And you could potentially include this set of activities. So one thing she always recommends is starting the meeting with some type of a community building activity, which might just, you know, as I mentioned, could simply be having board members share something about their past or their history or who they are to help people get to know one another. She always recommends involving food. I think that's really true. There's a lot of research to show that if there is communal food, it definitely builds a sense of community. It doesn't have to be anything terribly extensive, but, you know, it could just be a coffee service. It could just be, you know, some soft drinks. It could just be something really simple, but just a way to kind of help involve people feeling connected with one another. And then having something that starts at the beginning that inspires people to be reconnected to the mission of what the council is all about. So it could be that a board member attended an event in the community and wants to share and reflect on that experience. Or it could be that someone on the board recently witnessed, you know, some really awful thing that happened in the community, and they want to just reflect on how the community responded to that awful situation and just kind of have a heartfelt moment. Those heartfelt moments, especially when they happen at the beginning of the meeting, really tend to ground everyone back into the room. It helps everyone in the room remind themselves why they're there and why what they are doing is important and matters. And so then from there, you can, you know, hopefully use a consent agenda, if you do, to just move through some of the basic stuff like approval of minutes and other basic stuff, and leave the bulk of the time for a little bit of board education. So helping the board members get smarter, savvier, more up to speed on something about their role, and then doing the work of governing, making decisions, setting policy, reviewing issues, providing guidance back to the city or county manager, and that sort of activity. So that kind of formula for a great board meeting, if you think about it, it's front-loaded with board members doing things that are valuable and meaningful to board members, which I think always ends up with a much better result on the back end. When it comes to making decisions, those decisions will be less contentious. They might be less politically motivated. There might be fewer hidden agendas and personal agendas being put forward because they've really sort of reconnected with the idea that they are, in fact, a team, and they do all have to work together to make change. So that's, I think, a very helpful strategy. And then finally, kind of the last step in our cycle here is evaluation. I'm a huge proponent of doing annual board evaluations, but I'm a huge proponent of doing them in the right way. So I find most board evaluations are not done in the right way. Many of them are far too onerous and have way too many questions to really actually be useful. They're too generic. Nothing's ever done with the results. They just kind of sit on a shelf, and it's a check the box thing, like, yep, we did our evaluation, good for us. But we don't actually talk about the results and say, maybe we should spend some time in the next meeting focusing on this topic area, because clearly we maybe need some coaching on this, or some education on this, or some discussion around this. So a couple just suggestions. First of all, I think a full board self-assessment is a good idea, but I think even if you use a template to ask some of the basic questions, that's fine, but you should definitely amend that template to include questions that help the board measure its own progress around meeting its own stated purpose and priorities for the year or the cycle. So it makes zero sense for them not to measure how well they did on the things they said they were going to hold themselves accountable to. So if you do that process up front, you can now evaluate it on the back end. It's also really helpful to do peer evaluations, and I can tell you a really simple strategy for doing peer evaluations. First of all, by all means, use technology so it can be anonymous. This is the thing that always floors me. When I see boards going through the evaluation process and they say, we're going to do an individual director assessment and do a peer evaluation, and then they hand out paper forms or they send emails with attachments, and there's no way that that's ever going to be anonymous, because the person who's collecting that information and tallying it knows exactly what everyone said. And so what do you think is going to happen? Well, board members are not going to be candid. They're not going to be able to share what's really on their minds, because they know that there's probably going to be retaliation for that. They know someone is going to know that that person said that thing. And so it's going to be completely unpalatable, and they're going to end up giving everyone a really golden review, whether or not they deserve it, because that's the most politically palatable thing to do. So don't do any of that. Instead, if you're going to do a peer evaluation, do it anonymously. And there's so many tools that you can use to do this, from free to a little bit of cost to working with a firm. Any of those can work. The point is that it's got to be completely anonymous, meaning the person who administers the survey has no idea who said what. And the really easy way to do it is to have a question that just basically is a table listing the different board members on the left side on the rows, and then maybe evaluating them on a scale from 1 to 5 on issues such as provides valuable insight in their service to the board, or arrives at board meetings fully prepared to engage in the proceedings of the meeting, or provides valuable access to community networks and important perspectives. You can decide what you want the criteria to be. They should match whatever you put in your job descriptions for board members. But really, the point is, have everybody rate everyone, including themselves. That way, it's a completely anonymous process. And it also then can provide some helpful directives and some helpful feedback for each board member. They can then see, what sort of a grade did they get, and maybe use that as some, fodder for some board development. Maybe there's a candidate there who is really struggling, and maybe they're not fully engaged and fully participating because they really don't understand how they fit, and they've been really trying to figure it out, and maybe they've sort of given up. So this can be a really useful tool to help people re-engage and get reinvested in doing this important work. Finally, I would say, when you get this data, share that kind of benchmarking data back to the group, and you can certainly do that in an open meeting, because if you want to see how's the board doing, you can present it in summary so that it is not being presented director by director. I wouldn't suggest that gets necessarily shared, but you can then provide sort of in aggregate, this is what the board got as a grade overall. And we've identified these areas that we believe need to be addressed. We've identified that we need more education on things like cybersecurity. We know nothing about it, and we're concerned that we don't know enough about it. We're going to work with some people to get some better expertise and some better coaching on those issues. Or we recognize that we really need additional education on land use issues. We have a couple people that had that expertise. They've rotated off the board. We see this as a gap. So whatever it is, you can then provide that information in summary and talk about how you're going to be using it. So actually, just before I leave that, let me also give you maybe some suggestions on developing the evaluation. So I do have some things that I've written on my blog, which I'd be happy to send out. I'll send that over to Allison at ICMA, and if that's of interest to you, I'm sure she'd be happy to forward it on to you. I've got some samples. Some are put together by a group called BoardSource, which is a wonderful organization. They focus on nonprofit board member development. I can send you some of those things, and then some of them are things that I've created on my own. So I'd be happy to share that information with you if that's helpful. But I will say, board evaluations, really, you don't have to look for the magic template. The questions on the template are far less important than how you approach the process and what you actually do with the information afterwards. But I'll be happy to share with you some suggestions on how to do that well. And then finally, just a word about retention. I think sometimes what ends up happening is we have some really exceptionally good board members who decide not to run for reelection or decide to leave. And we often are just really kind of dismayed by that because they were amazing, they were doing great work, and they go. And sometimes, we sort of focus on retention as the big need, right? We say, oh, well, we need better ability to retain board members. We seem to be losing the really good ones, and so we got to focus on retention. The thing is, if you focus on the other three parts of the cycle, retention should be a no-brainer. It should be easy. So, if you have the opportunity to, set the set of board priorities for the year, get the board to state its purpose, have the board hold itself accountable to those things, provide ongoing education and orientation, give them support, give them a friendly ear that they can bend when they need to, retention really shouldn't be an issue. If someone feels they've got to leave for a reason, you should see it coming miles away, and you should be able to work with that person to make that happen in a really friendly and face-saving fashion because you've done all this front-loading of the process. So retention is almost never the thing that you put your energy to. If you're not retaining well, it's not a retention problem, a retention strategy problem. It's more so look further up that food chain and see where is it that you're not spending your energy. Maybe you're not doing good planning. Maybe you're not doing good orientation. Maybe you're not doing good engagement. So usually that's the case. But finally, if retention if you're looking at sort of the flip side of retention, where maybe there is someone that it's time for that person to rotate and their term is not up for a long time, or there's something really happening that's not good, use the evaluation results as a way to kind of have some conversations and bring some things to light and then provide better support and better services back to the board so that they can become stronger and better. And then finally, what I always recommend is, look, the culture of the group, and what I mean by the culture of the group, I mean is the culture that they form together as a group. I don't mean what cultural background they come from. I mean, what's the dynamic in the room? Is it contentious? Do they not trust one another? Or do they understand that they're actually all on the same team and they have to rely on one another? You can focus energy on building that, and you can do that by giving them opportunities to get to know each other. Even when we disagree, even when we have totally divergent political views, if we get to know each other, we're much more likely to want to work together to find a compromise. And if you don't believe me, I can think about my own father, who has passed away, but he was always exactly on the opposite end of the political spectrum from me. And you would think that it would make it so that we could never talk about politics, but in actual fact, it became one of our favorite topics because we were always so fascinated in what the other person thought, because it was so different from what we thought. So we would actually talk about it a lot. But it's because we had established this mutual respect and trust for one another that we could have that conversation without hating each other for the other's opinion. It's because we knew each other really well, right? He was my dad. So I think, look, I'm not saying that everyone needs to be family in the boardroom. What I am saying is if you build some type of a personal relationship, even if it's just a really basic one, you are probably going to be able to listen and tolerate that person's divergent viewpoints much better than if you've spent no time getting to know them as a person. If they just remain kind of a collection of ideas, not a real flesh and blood human being, it's easier to write them off and ignore them. And so if we want to try to get our boards to gel and form a team and make good decisions, we have to do things to try to promote that kind of cohesion. So that's probably way more information than you wanted. I noticed that we have a couple of questions. Allison, do you want to go through some of the questions?
Absolutely. And they actually touch on the same issue. And it's about peer evaluations being open record and how
right.
that could cause issues if it's published to the public.
Absolutely, yeah. So really, really good question. Yeah, you're right. I mean, that is definitely a concern, right? It's going to be publicly open and public record. Look, I mean, I think it's still going to be worth thinking about doing, and the reason I say that is because, again, speaking as a board member, I know that I want to know how I'm doing. I think that at some level, we all want to know that we're doing a good job. And if it's so interesting. At work, I just went through a 360 evaluation. There were a couple areas that came back. They weren't rated so good. And it was extremely helpful to me because I thought, oh my gosh, you know what? Actually, I agree. Those are areas where I need to grow. And I have reasons for why I'm not strong there yet. And I know exactly what I want to do to fix it. And so, and that, by the way, that information is shared in the company. I know that it's open. So, look, it can certainly be a little interesting to have that information going out to the public. You have to do it. I would say, though, from the perspective of the board, it's also a little bit of incentive to make sure that they are, in fact, doing the things that they need to do. And keep in mind, it's not a matter of, well, John Smith hates me, and John Smith's going to give me a 1. Well, okay, but that's not what the results are going to show. The results are going to show that, yeah, you got a 1, but you got 1. You maybe got, 7 5s from everybody else, or 14 5s from everybody else. So again, the results get shared in aggregate. You're not seeing what John Smith said. You're seeing what the board as a whole said about that individual director's performance. And in that regard, if there is one place where there's a, kind of a number of low ratings across the board, then that's an opportunity to put into the report that goes out in front of the public that we've identified some places where we need to really do a better job of providing support and coaching and education for our board members. And we're going to be doing that. And here's the plan. And quite frankly, look, these are elected officials. I don't think it's unreasonable for members of the public to know how they're doing. Right? Again, I'm sure everyone's going to disagree with me, so don't jump down the phone on my throat. But know that I think, look, this is civic participation. I think people deserve to know what kind of a job the folks are really doing and how others view their work. And frankly, it can be helpful, too, if the public has one viewpoint of a particular person's performance, and then this evaluation comes back, and they're actually doing really well in a bunch of areas. It can also kind of help move the needle a little bit on public opinion. So you can kind of look at it that way as well. Anyway, I'm sure there's going to be lots of opinions about that issue, but hopefully that helps to give a little bit of reflection on that question. I think we have just about 1 minute left, so I'm going to ask Allison. I know we had a couple of other questions. I'll be happy to maybe take those offline and send answers to those that didn't get their questions answered. And I also just want to invite you, this is my contact information. If you had questions that you wanted to talk through, I'd be happy to speak with you. This is what I'm a little bit geeky about. I love board governance. You don't come up with a title like governance technology evangelist for nothing. So if you can't tell, I really am pretty passionate about my subject area. I would love to talk with you. And as I mentioned, we will be at the ICMA conference this year. And I think actually that there's actually going to be kind of a cool party happening, if I'm not mistaken, that Board Docs is throwing there at ICMA. And everyone's invited. We'd love to see you all if that's of interest to you. You just got to stop by the booth and pick up a pass, but we'd love to see you. And then also, as I mentioned, we've got a session happening about shared governance. And so, if you have an opportunity, if these topics interest you, please come to that panel. I think our panelists would love to see you there, and I know it's going to be a really interesting session. So I think that is everything. Allison, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you. On behalf of ICMA, I would like to thank you all for joining us today, and I'd also like to thank Dottie for her excellent presentation. At this point, I'd like to alert the attendees to the survey that I've just put up on your screen. We do ask that you take a moment to fill out this survey, as it does help ICMA plan future presentations. And after you've completed the survey, you should notice a button appear on your screen. And in order to obtain a certificate of completion for this session, you will select the button and go through the submission process. This concludes today's session. To disconnect, simply hang up and exit out of your browser window.